Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Jose, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast. I think you're doing a great job there. My name is Jose. I'm Dr. Martínez-Raga. I'm a psychiatrist from Valencia, Spain. I'm head of psychiatry in one of the local catchment areas in Valencia. I'm teaching at the university, and I'm coordinating one adult ADHD clinic. It's one of the few clinics in Spain within our National Health Service, specifically for adolescents and adults with ADHD.
How'd you get interested in ADHD? I mean, when did that start?
Well, I mean, I guess it's part of why I'm interested in psychiatry. I mean, it's always, I think most of us doing psychiatry, we are puzzled with an unknown territory that the brain is and the mind is, and probably is the next frontier to explore more than the moon or anything. And then within the mind and within the brain, ADHD, I've been doing for many years addiction, so I like to do difficult disorders and difficult issues. And on one side, I mean, I trained in London, and in London there's a larger tradition of ADHD, partly because, I mean, child psychiatry was it was one of the initial points where child psychiatry was born, but also it was one of the first clinics I trained remotely where they had an adult ADHD clinic. And then if you're doing addictions, you realize that a large percentage of your patients are different in a sense of having some symptoms that are not solely explained by personality, by the drug addiction itself. And that's why ADHD is so frequent among individuals with substance use disorder. And then when I moved to general psychiatry, I decided to go search a bit deeper into this field. And
Can I ask more about the addiction? I went to school for chemical dependency. So I'm just curious, is it the compulsive aspect of ADHD that causes the addiction aspect of things? I mean, it's compulsive. I'm a compulsive workout person. It's not that I'm addicted to working out. It's more about just I have the need and drive to go do that, but I can easily get sucked into any other substance of any other sort. But I know the dangers of those things, and I choose working out to be the less addictive one. So, I mean, is it the compulsive aspect in the behavior? Or is there just something else going on?
It's a very good question, actually, and I don't think it has a real answer to that, because, I mean, for many years it was thought that it was more common with those ADHD individuals with predominantly hyperactive or presentation, and but it appears across the three subtypes or the many different presentations of ADHD. And I mean, it's often, I mean, even with the purely inattentive type, I mean, the often the difficulties in fitting into the social group also makes them more vulnerable. I mean, bear in mind that, for instance, one of the common feature of ADHD, should be one of the diagnostic criteria somewhere in the future, is the mood dysregulation that is present among ADHD. Therefore, having problems with self-esteem and having problems with the whole affective component is very common, and that makes some of the ADHD groups more vulnerable. But at the end, at the other end, I mean, of course, the very impulsive ADHD subtypes are also very, very vulnerable to substance use. So, but at the end of the day, it's more an individual predisposition than a phenotype.
Who do you see have more, I guess, of the certain categories or subtypes? So, like, what's a more prominent one? Is it the hyperactive? Like, I have hyperactive.
Yeah.
I would even probably throw maladaptive dreaming up there as well, daydreaming. I didn't notice I was doing that when I was doing like 6 hours of cardio until I talked to someone about ADHD, and he was like, "You should probably look into that." And I realized, oh, that's exactly what I do. I create a scenario in my head and I just go off, and then 6 hours goes by like it's nothing. I mean, that could also link into the time thing that I'm having an issue with. I keep missing chunks of time, thinking that next thing you know, we're already in May, and I thought it was April. So there's issues there, obviously, but I feel like I can try and find ways to coordinate those out. But what's the most prominent one? Is it the hyperactivity?
No, not at all, not at all. The hyperactivity is probably the more resonant, the more visible type of ADHD. But in adults, the most common type is across the whole lifespan. I mean, particularly in adults, the inattentive, and it's very common, for instance, that children whose symptoms become very apparent at the early childhood. First, during childhood are primarily hyperactive. Then, during their adolescent years, a combined type with both inattentive and hyperactive. And then, when they become adults, then the hyperactivity tends to resolve, and the inattention stays. That's also one of the issues.
Is that because like life beat them down to where they don't have any energy left in them? Is that like a common thing with this? I know adult ADHD, it's harder to diagnose either because they're managing their symptoms with however they're managing their symptoms, but
So, no, I don't agree with that necessarily. I mean, I remember some years ago I was with a colleague who is a child psychiatrist, and he said, "Oh, I don't know how you manage to diagnose ADHD in adults. It must be very difficult." And I said, "Well, for me, it's very difficult to diagnose in children. It's a matter of how I don't see children. I mean, of course, I was trained when I did my training, but that's it. And if you not continue, there's a totally different world to assess and to explore children. And for me, it would be much more difficult because it's a matter of being familiar of what you're looking for. And at the end of the day, I mean, one of the issues that we face with ADHD among many colleagues is that they are not sensitive to detect ADHD, and often it gets misdiagnosed, partly because of inattention, but mostly also because ADHD rarely comes alone, and over 80% of ADHD individuals have another psychiatric disorder, which may appear to be more disturbing, but in actual fact fluctuates around the ADHD.
let's put more common another disorder that they might have.
Well, I mean, like in general population, I mean, depression and anxiety are the most common disorders. But bear in mind that there are large epidemiological studies showing that ADHD individuals have approximately 6 times higher risk of developing an anxiety disorder, 7 times higher risk of developing a depressive disorder, 8 times higher of developing a bipolar disorder, or it's 2 to 3 times of developing an eating disorder, or 3 times of developing a substance use disorder. So across the whole spectrum. For instance, if we focus solely in the addiction population, we know that in general population, in adults, it's between 5-8% the prevalence of ADHD. And that's what the latest epidemiological studies are showing across the world. In the addiction population, it's approximately 25%. So 1 in every 4 individuals with an addictive disorder has ADHD as well. Now, if you're showing up to treatment and you're addicted to cocaine or to cannabis or whatever, what are you likely to see? What's more apparent? But unless you treat the underlying disorder that perpetuates the addictive disorder, you're only going to be partially effective.
Are you basing the depression and anxiety stuff off the reason like someone has ADHD, they are more likely to develop depression and anxiety, and that depression and anxiety can lead to substance abuse?
Not necessarily. I mean, in some cases, yes, but in some cases not. So bear in mind going back to numbers and to what the research says. And so as I said, about 80% of adults have another psychiatric disorder, the whole spectrum. Now, about 80% of them have at least 2 psychiatric disorders. So the likelihood of having depression plus substance use disorder or plus eating disorder or plus anxiety disorder is much higher than general population.
Because a hyperfixation aspect of something?
No, not necessarily. I mean, as I said, one of the key issues is the mood regulation that underlies ADHD and is part of. I mean, bear in mind that ADHD is a dysfunction of one part of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain, which is the most sophisticated part of our brain, where all the information that we get from the outside and from the inside gets analyzed, filtered, and then our actions. Now, often, and that's part of the problem of the diagnostic criteria, that they envisage it in a more mechanical manner. But we are human beings, and therefore our emotions are part of it. And so therefore all the external inputs of our emotional, of our interaction with other human beings or with other elements, but also our internal feelings analyzed and scrutinized with all the mechanical elements of our functioning. So as I said, I mean, integrating all the information that we get from our actions and from our interactions with mechanical interactions or physical interactions with other human beings or other elements that we do on a daily practice. That's part of what our prefrontal cortex does, but also integrating that with all our emotional part of our brain, and also all the emotional inputs that we get from the outside.
Yeah, being overstimulated, for instance, can create a lot of
but also not only
dread.
that, not only being overstimulated, because that can be part of it, but also being desynchronized in some way. So, for instance, am I laughing when I should be hugging someone, or when I should be just quiet? Am I doing the proper reaction, or does it mean that I should be that I'm being praised or I'm being criticized? And that's not solely the physical interpretation of the words, but also how we emotionally react to those words.
I think I get what you're saying. I guess it will depend on the context and depend on the person. If a person came up to me and said something that a friend would say to me, and I'd have a different reaction to because I knew how my friend was. But if it's just a random stranger that might be trying to break conversation, might say something, I might receive it a different way.
Sure, but for instance, let me give you there's a group of ADHD and generally hyperactive ADHD, with, for instance, when they are kids or when they are adolescents, they tend to be the joker in the class, and they believe they are very funny, and they believe they're very popular. But actually, when you ask any of their classmates, they say they are absolutely fed up with them because they don't know when to stop. They don't know when it's enough to say a joke, not because they are harassing anyone, because simply because it's time to do something else, and not knowing when to stop, not knowing when to be funny, not knowing when to be serious is part of this emotional understanding of what's going on.
Okay, I get that. Yeah, I relate to that a little bit. Definitely was called annoying more than once. And through school, but I also feel like there wasn't a whole large amount of information on ADHD when I was in school. There was a large amount of this person's just something about his personality. It's just not normal. It's not, and that word also, like even the word disorder, I kind of have a little bit of a problem with, because when you start talking about emotional irregularities and you start talking about these things, immediately my head goes to bipolar disorder and other things that seem like a little bit more of a problem, because you don't know if someone could just snap at the flip of a hat. Like even I talked to Stephen Ferrone, I think his last name is. I don't want to mispronounce his name, but he was talking about being over, like people that could be angry when they're driving with ADHD. And I just mentioned, I mean, the way you would describe ADHD being angry driving, I would just say reactionary. I mean, everyone's reactionary when they drive, except ADHD people don't necessarily know where that filter or that bound is. There are some things that I tend to not know where the stopping line is, but I'm not going to chase anybody down and go after their car. That would be insane. But no,
Exactly.
that's, yeah.
So anyone can react in a particular way, but when this happens more than what it should happen to anyone like you, your education, your condition, and everything, in that same situation, then it's when this reaction is not normal, to say the word. Now, what were you asking before? Sorry, I lost my track.
I would say a lot more people, ADHD, would spend a lot more energy trying to maintain a certain look like they aren't doing much, trying to put down their symptoms more. You know, that's why when you said that it's actually harder to diagnose or easier to diagnose in adults, I would say that it's, to me, it just looks like, I mean, at that point, people have learned the social scaffolding. There are certain situations that the buildup where I can't have the outbursts and I can't do this type of thing that I want to do because I know it's not fit for this social situation.
Yeah, well, yeah, but to a certain extent, actually, what actually happens is that when you have certain obstacles in how to react, or in the way you interact with other people from childhood, what you learn is to adapt to that. So, for instance, if you know that you will have difficulties the following morning trying to see where you left your keys, your phone, or whatever, what you instinctively do is prepare a place at your house entrance or at your room entrance where you leave your keys, your wallet, and whatever. Now, for whatever reasons, imagine you have to go to the toilet, or the phone rings, and you cannot leave your things at that spot. Forget it. You will lose a lot of time the following morning trying to find your stuff. What I mean is, all these compensating measures is what is, as I believe what you were mentioning earlier. Let me go back to one of the things you were pointing out. You know why we call it disorder instead of disease?
I think we could find a better name than both those.
No, we differentiate between illness, disease, and disorder, depending on whether we're focusing on symptoms or we're focusing on the functional impairment that the symptoms cause. So we call disorder when actually we are focusing on the functional impact. So in the case of ADHD, when we diagnose, we have to identify a certain amount of inattention or hyperactive symptoms, hyperactive impulsivity symptoms. But those symptoms need to be present in more one situation. So if you only have problems in school, you're not going to have ADHD. You're going to have something else. Okay, so you need to identify that symptoms are present, but they are present in more than one situation, and that's why effect. And see, I remember a patient who is actually a colleague, is a doctor, and she asked me to assess her. She was in the 40s back then, and she said, "Well, what's the point? I mean, you seem to have a very successful life. You're a doctor. You're married. You have children." And she said, "Well, look, I've actually calculated, and I waste approximately 2.5 days per month because of ADHD, and not that time that we waste doing nothing because we are just in the couch or whatever. It's that time of time that we waste going back home to pick up things that we forgot when we left initially, or wasting time to go trying to see where we left our paperwork, or trying to where we are procrastinating because we have to do paperwork at work and so forth, or why we always go to this in the same route to work regardless of how traffic it is, because that's the way our brain has learned it."
That's interesting. Oh, was that person diagnosed later in life?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I was about to say, me being born with it, find certain measures where I'm not that forgetful. Like that's not a common thing with me on certain things. I pre-plan a lot of stuff as well too. The only issue is the task overload is a big problem. I take on 50 different tasks and seem to always kind of finish it right at the last moment. But if you don't give me a deadline on something, that task is never going to be completed.
Exactly. Yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, if we do just simply by combining the different symptoms, and we have almost 200 different phenotypes, and that's just by solely symptom combination. But I mean, at the end of the day, each patient is different. But see, for instance, when we diagnose, and for instance, we are assessing concentration, and we ask whether you have difficulties in finishing a book or in staying for a long time in a task. That's accepting in those issues where you have a particular interest. So you may, and often, for instance, we see that, for instance, with a TV show, with a series, one of these, that may happen with everyone, but more often patients with ADHD may see the whole season or several seasons in a row. During a couple of days or a week, because they cannot wait for the next episode, or if they, for whatever reasons, they break and they have to wait a week for the next season or for half the season, they may forget about it and move on, regardless how captioned they were about the season.
Are you talking about, you're talking about hyper focus, right?
Yeah, there is a hyperfocus as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
some people call that a superpower.
In specific issues that you have a very personal or very intellectual interest. But for other things, it is very difficult to focus. And that's beyond what happens with non-ADHD people.
Yeah, I noticed that. I know some people call it an ADHD superpower. I don't necessarily consider it a superpower. I mean, I learn a lot from it. Like if I learn about a topic, that's why my show covers a wide range. I usually get focused into something and try and learn as much as I can about it. But there's also like lack of interest in other things as well too. And your mind kind of just sets focus on that one specific thing. It's like I watched Bob Ross yesterday. Right now, I'm thinking about painting. As much as I'm like trying to think about ADHD, it's just there's that little part of my brain that's like, you could be trying to do this. Now, I learned painting really quickly, and it does look really good. But it's also when you're talking about everyday tasks, that's not an easy thing to do when you're working. And luckily,
exactly.
I don't have a job that's not.
Surely, but probably in a couple of days' time, you forget about painting and something else has attracted your attention.
And
because that's not what happens to non-ADHD individuals. I mean, the interest is not so intense and so short in a sense.
Now, has there been studies to try and use that in a more positive manner instead of just trying to dumb down that part of the symptoms?
No, of course, I think, and that's, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I mean, with any disorder, but I think especially, particularly with ADHD, it is very important not solely to focus on the difficulties, but on the healthy aspects, on the positive aspects. I mean, and partly in relation to what we mentioned earlier, that individuals with ADHD develop skills to compensate some of the difficulties, and so trying to focus all those skills that are there in those abilities and those interests that are more personal to them is one of the key elements as well for growing out of ADHD.
Can you maybe mention some of like the positive or some of the skill aspects of things? I've noticed certain characteristics like loyalty a little bit, dependability, some things that I thought were just good work ethic in certain scenarios turn out they're
for
not
instance,
average qualities.
let me give you an example. I mean, in principle, ADHD individuals are very inconstant. They have very difficulties in maintaining a task. But in contrast, they are very hard-headed. They are very tenacious, and that's why they tend to try over and over again to do a task. So if we substitute the difficulties in maintaining in developing a routine by that tenacity, by that hard-headedness, we can actually turn it around and make them success in daily tasks. So it is important to make them aware of that, so that it's not just solely that you're very stubborn, that you're very hard-headed, but that can be a positive thing.
So a lot of the overcompensation for finding another way to do a task that might be easier for an average person with non-ADHD to complete. The overcompensation means you have to put in a little bit more work, but doesn't some people would also look at that as, I wouldn't say finding another solution to a problem, but kind of out of the box thinking as well too. And it just happens to be happenstance that because we were overcompensating, we came across that out of the box idea.
No, because as I mentioned, for instance, in the example I mentioned earlier about putting things in your empty pocket spot, let me put it this way. If for whatever reasons you forget or you cannot or whatever, then you cannot find them the following day. So it only covers part of it, but it doesn't make you overcome the difficulties. And that difficulty in finding things, where did I left stuff? If you go to a hotel, if you go to a new place, I mean, you don't have your preferential spot. And therefore, the likelihood that you may forget to take something with you, it's much higher, or to go back to the place where you are, and so it only covers while you are in your safety environment, in your comfort zone.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to. I'm curious if it's just the case by case basis, because I would have to ask about that person that's forgetting things. I'm like, what's their workload? If you're going on vacation, what are you thinking besides vacation? You should only be thinking if you're going to have a Mai Tai, a pina colada, or if you're going to go down to the hotel and maybe switch out a room key because you didn't like the room that you went into. There's always like certain scenarios that are limited to that area, but I feel like I don't know, the forgetfulness aspect thing. I try my hardest to set methods for that.
For instance, I was in a conference yesterday, and one of my colleagues, he has a diagnosed ADHD, and he's in his 60s, and was diagnosed some decades ago. I saw him. He arrived on in the morning, and I saw him early afternoon, and he had already lost 3 hotel keys. Had to go back to the reception.
That's something else. That ain't ADHD. I'm sorry, man. I've never had that experience in my entire life.
You
I don't know
haven't?
how. That's
No.
like Alzheimer's, man.
No, not at all. You haven't. It hasn't happened to you that you left your key in the room?
I've left a key once, maybe in a room before, not 3 times. I mean, everyone leaves their, like, same thing with losing your cell phone. There's people with non-ADHD or any disorders in general that lose their cell phone. I know more people that don't have it that lose it more than I do.
Fair enough. And that's when that symptom doesn't apply. That's why each patient is differently. So for each symptom, for instance, we have different examples that we have to identify, so that if for 2 or 3 examples of a specific symptom, there is a repeated pattern, that's when we point across it as positive. So in your case, this wouldn't apply, but probably would apply other aspects of ADHD, as you mentioned. You have ADHD.
So like if you saw a pattern of someone's aggression at certain moments that they were getting angry, would you be able to correlate to the specific thing that's angering them? Or would you be able to find that there's a pattern of aggression on a particular situation in their life?
It depends on whether it joins with other symptoms. For instance, it is very common that individuals, it's one of the symptoms, one of the aspects that is very common, that individuals with ADHD have the tendency to talk before thinking. So how many times have you, that's one of the things that we question, how many times have you thought, oh, I should have bite my tongue or things like that, rather than
every day of my life.
Sorry?
Every day of my life.
Exactly. So, of course, that happens to everyone, but in non-ADHD individuals, it happens very rarely, very occasionally. In individuals with ADHD, it happens quite commonly.
That's fair.
Okay.
see. Then
For instance, what you mentioned earlier with traffic, of course, we can get all wind up in traffic, but the tendency to wipe the horn because the car in front of you has only passed 2 seconds and he hasn't moved. It's much more common in those with ADHD than those without.
I can see that.
Okay, that's impulsivity, for instance.
That's yeah. I mean, again, that would have to be a case by case basis too.
Exactly.
The way I would
So,
look at that would be a
if you're
time thing.
if you're solely impulsive in that context, that's something different. But if you put it, if you see that there is that joins other symptoms of hyperactivity, being restless, difficulties in relaxing in any situation, difficulties in inputting your mind without anything, difficulties in staying still in any situation where you have to stay still, and that doesn't mean that you get up. It makes that you move in your chair. So that's examples that can emerge. But I mean, there are many different examples across the different symptoms. But if you only have one problem in one specific area, that's not ADHD. That's something different, and let's explore what it is.
Do you think a lot of this boils down to people's like that people with ADHD's perception of time because they move around? Like for me, I move around very quick. When you're talking about sitting behind a car that's not moving and the light's green, it just turned green. And my urge to be like, why aren't you going? Well, I mean, a lot of people have that urge, but also a honk or something like that is just because this person feels like they've been sitting here for now 5 minutes.
Yeah, and again, that's not present in all ADHD individuals, but it is very common that the concept of time is very different in both extremes. I mean, there are those who are absolutely sharp on time and they don't tolerate any minute delay by anyone in any given situation. And there are those who, oh, I'll be ready in 5 minutes, and 5 minutes for them is nothing to do with what 5 minutes are for me or for anyone else. I have a friend who I always say when he says 5 minutes, say 5 minutes your time or my time. You know what I mean? Or when you're meeting friends that they say, let's meet at 7, and or they call, we are downstairs waiting for you, and I'm coming out, I'm almost ready, and you haven't even taken the shower yet. Or when you're for instance you finish earlier, you still have 20 minutes and you start a task which if you think carefully, you know it will take 2 hours, but you think you have enough time to finish the task in those 20 minutes. Because your time clock is very different.
I mean, how much does this boil down? Like, how much would be a benefit if we had people like family members, friends, people that were in that person's life who had that type of disorder or ADHD to learn more about ADHD and have a more positive impact on understanding? Like my boss, for instance, kind of figured out that I had ADHD. I didn't have to say it, and they asked. I was like, yes. I don't think it bothers my life at all. They're like, no, I could tell you talk really fast and you're kind of like going, okay. But they started researching a little bit about it. And the way they talk to me is how every other manager ended up learning how to talk to me. You just can't talk down to me because it just goes in one ear and out the other ear if you do that. But if you ask me to do something, you kind of talk to me on the same playing field, it goes through and I'll complete the task because I've set something up myself to be able to do so. But that comes from education, that comes from learning, that comes from awareness about ADHD in general as well too. And we live in I don't know if it's changing now, but from when I was a kid and nobody ever even talked about it or even accepted it, saying it was in my head, which is like, that's the problem. I feel like if the tides are turning, wouldn't that just be better education and awareness to make it more comfortable and more adaptable in a situation where you can care for someone or understand where a person's perspective is who has ADHD? I'm not shooting down medication. I'm not doing that. I'm just saying that for everyone's got their own individual path in life. And when we think about people like myself who necessarily don't want to use the medication or don't want to do anything like that, I think there's ways to adapt with it to make it easier. And you might have to take some sacrifices with it as well, too, if that's your path you want to take. But also a lot of this comes from awareness, too. I mean, I'm more aware of people with bipolar disorder or anyone that has some type of condition that I necessarily don't experience myself, but I try and understand, ask them about it. We don't do that as people, which means that you have a large subjection towards whatever or this, or people just stay away because they don't know. And I think there's a large amount of non-education in ADHD. Some people still don't even consider that a disorder.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean but it the same appeals to depression and to anxiety. I mean, until they suffer. No, I fully agree with you. I mean, educating the surrounding is very important. I mean, for instance, with parents, what often a very structured environment at home acts as a compensator of the chaotic prefrontal cortex of the kid. So it helps remodeling the brain. It helps adapting, and in a sense, it's part of treatment without knowing that it's treatment. So, for instance, having parents that sit with the kid to do the tasks, the homework, and trying to have everything, trying to help them learn routines and yeah, exactly. What you mentioned about work, again, that's extremely important. And for instance, it is very common in certain, there are certain jobs where ADHD are more frequent, partly because they path the way towards that type of work. And any time of non-sitting work, where you may have contact with clients, or you may have other types of contact where you're on the run on the way. For instance, let me put you an example. I mean, usually salesmen, there is a higher representation among those with ADHD, and they're extremely good because they are very intuitive, and that's another positive side about ADHD. They're very creative as well. They have, despite their poor social abilities, they have good social skills. What we mentioned earlier about being outgoing. So they may have some of the best statistics in sales, right? Now, if you're very good in one job, usually they promote you, and if they promote you, they put you behind the desk, and then you have to do administrative work, the schedules, timetables, numbers, and that's where many ADHD individuals have huge difficulties, and that's when they fail.
I would have thought it would have been the boredom aspect. I feel like usually with my jobs,
that as well. I mean, it all sums up. I mean, boredom it's routine, it's organizing the routine, the administrative work. I mean, it's all many different aspects to it. And as I said, that's when they have more difficulty, and often, as I said, they drop down in their performance. So knowing where you're very good at, and providing you with the best assets to be even better in those abilities is very important for any employer.
You mentioned you mentioned intuitive, though.
Yeah.
Is that just being able to like sense emotional empathy? What is that? Is that being able to sense?
No, intuitive is thinking. For instance, one negative side of being intuitive is, for instance, which is part of being impatient and being impulsive, is when you're talking with someone and this other person is having difficulties in finishing the sentence because it's not finding the right word. Often you see patients with ADHD that finish the sentence for them. In many situations, right? You maybe the right word or not, but I mean, you have the intuition that this is the right word. That's an unconscious thing. So intuition usually is associated with creativity, and it's having the spontaneity to come up with something without really being the most knowledgeable about something. Usually that's part of it, part of being intuitive. And as I said, sometimes it can have the downside of being putting yourself in in a situation where you talk too fast or where you talk when what you shouldn't do. But on the other side is that you come up with the right idea when somebody else is thinking, and suddenly you have this creative intuition with the right idea. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, do you see any characteristics like that with younger kids? I mean, I don't know how much their educational value is on certain subjects, so I'm just curious if you come across more of them. I'm guessing the hyper stuff, but I would consider that being probably hard to diagnose because how many people would just say, "Oh, they're just being a child." You know, I got that my whole entire early childhood.
I'm thinking of. I'm an adult psychiatrist, so I mean, I'm thinking about adults. That it's often the case as well. Um, um,
I'm curious how someone develops it later on in life. Is that like a trauma
no, I mean,
thing?
usually it comes from kid. I mean, you always have the ability to come
But
up.
don't they grow out of it too? Steven told me that it's like one of three adults, and I was like, damn, am I that one out of three that got it still? Because that sucks. But I don't know anything different. So everything you described of like you'll be better if you're like this. I'm like, I don't want to know what that different is. I like this. This is what I'm used to. This is what I'm comfortable with. I've set up my life to be able to figure this out.
It is true that there is a percentage. I mean, there is a remission in a percentage of children and adolescents with ADHD, and that's why, for instance, as I said, the prevalence in children is approximately about 10%. In adults, it's about 2.5 to 5% roughly, because there is a significant number of children who grow out of the disorder. Now, in the milder cases, it may be without any treatment, and not solely talking about medication, I'm talking about treatment. But in the moderate or severe cases, what we may see is we could see a partial remission. I mean, that you don't have the full syndrome, but you have partial symptoms that remain and interfere with your performance, with your functional ability. See, and I mean, part of helping you to grow out of it, and certainly, I mean, it has to do partly with your brain, and that's why it's called a neurodevelopmental disorder. Your brain can fully grow, mature, and overcome the problems. But it is more often the case that when this is the case, it's generally because either there has been an aware or treatment-oriented home environment where the kid has a lot of structure, and therefore, in a sense, what all those structure and all your skills, all your abilities, is teaching your brain to do things differently, and it's teaching your brain to use dopamine in a different way than what it's tends to do because of the ADHD. That's what medication tends to do as well, and that's why we rely so much on medication. And it's not, and partly because this is probably the area of the brain where medication has the largest impact than compared to any other areas. Now,
like I said, I'm not against medication. I'd recommend it if someone wanted to take that route 100%, especially if I had a kid with it. I'd probably say, give it a try. See if, I don't want them to live the same thing with the social isolation aspect that a lot of people don't really understand, especially going through school. That's horrible stuff. But also, I'm at the point now where it's like, if I have this and this is about me, I want to try and find a way to make sure that I can use it to my benefit and not just spend my whole life being upset that I have this. You know what I mean? That could make you really, really depressed. So it's like, how you look at it.
Yeah, no, of course. And I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, it's a matter of working with a patient, and it's not something that the physician has to decide on his or her own. And again, the patient cannot decide on his or her own either, because I mean, there can be side effects, there can be contraindications or whatever, or simply it's not appropriate to use medication at all. It has to be a joint interaction. I mean, Look at it this way. I mean, I remember, and nothing to do with ADHD, but it's a lot to do with what we're just discussing. I have a patient who has a severe anxiety disorder, and she was referred to me after 2-3 years of psychological treatment. She was referred to me by a psychologist. She was very much against medications. I mean, she hardly could get out of home. She was in the late 20s. She was a dentist, and had panic attacks almost every day. And 2 years later, and when she was recovered, and she said, "Well, I'm very pleased. I'm very grateful to you and to my psychologist." I mean, she continued to go with her. And one of the things that I'm most grateful is that you explained me why medication was needed. And I realized along the way when it helped me improve what I hadn't improved before with the psychological work that she continued to do. And apparently medication helped her take more advantage of the psychological work. That doesn't mean that any patient with anxiety disorder has to get medication. Of course not. But that's also our task, to assess and help the patient when we consider that medication is a must. One of the things that, for instance, with medications, we know is that in those cases where medication is needed, I mean, the duration of illness is shorter when there is a continuity of medication than, for instance, when there is stop and go. At the end of the day, what you don't any one of us doesn't want to take medication, for our stomach problems, for our brain problems, or for our whatever. But if we have to take medications, that it has to be the shortest period needed.
Yeah, see, that stop and go thing, I don't know if I think that necessarily is good. I don't know. I have friends that take it stop and go, but then I'm like, doesn't that like really mess up your body a little bit of like doing it? And then,
of course not. Yeah, of course. I mean, if you take medication, you need to take it until it's. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's a personal issue about each patient, assessing each patient different separately, and assess what his or her needs are.
No, it's interesting to me because the various perspectives that people either pro medication or they're against medication, and then I kind of go into the conversation. I just kind of stick by. I mean, if it works for someone, it works for somebody. But I'm starting to notice that there's probably a very big stigma on ADHD medication because the number of reactions I've gotten between either you or some other people I've talked to on ADHD, I'm starting to realize, is there a stigma behind the ADHD medication that I just don't know about? But hey, I'm learning. I'm trying to understand it, but I don't know. I mean, there's a thing with pharmaceutical companies. People just don't have a good reaction towards, and whether that's media, whether that's other things. I think the tide's turning, but I think that depends on the number of people, specifically for ADHD, not other pharmaceutical stuff, because I've looked into other stuff and it's horrible. But ADHD in particular, I think that goes up with the population of people that are experiencing it. More people are going to research into it if they have a kid who suffers from ADHD. It needs to physically affect that person's life, whether it's their kid, whether it's their sister, whether it's their brother, whether it's their mom, whether it's their dad. That's the only incentive they're going to have to want to learn about it. Now, if you start teaching it in schools and having teachers prep on that, because teachers tend to be more empathetic or tend to be a caregiving aspect of things, I think you'll see a tide turn on that. I don't think I'm wrong in saying that.
I'm not sure if I fully understood what you yeah, but one of the aspects, I mean, I fully agree that there is a great stigma to medication and to ADHD, but it is to ADHD as well. I mean, the issue is not whether you're anti or pro medication. I mean, how much nonsense we hear about not believing on or being against medication. I mean, being a negationist, as they were negationists to vaccines or to whatever illness. The actual fact is we have children, we have adolescents, we have adults that suffer. And we can give a label to it. We can identify it as ADHD. Often, for instance, when we see adults in the 30s who come for diagnosis, often many of those have had problems that led them to seek psychological or psychiatric care since late teens or early 20s. And often in many of those have been through different psychotherapies and different medications and only partially improved. And no one up to a point, came up to the idea, maybe what you have is ADHD. And when they realize it's ADHD, it's like a relief. It's like everything makes sense to them. This is quite a common issue. Now, with medication and the stigma and discrimination about it, I mean, just bear in mind one thing. I mean, the first clinical trials in psychiatry are in the 50s, when lithium and some of the antipsychotics came into the market. Well, that's not true. The first clinical trial, the first proper research trial, was in the mid-30s with amphetamines for ADHD. So the accumulated knowledge that we have about our medications for over 80 years is so huge, with huge databases of patients across all the ages, that we can be absolutely sure about what we expect or what side effects we can expect in most patients. Of course, at the end of the day, each patient matters, and we have to assess each patient separately and assess whether medication or whether any other treatment is appropriate or not. And in any case, we need to provide psychoeducation to the illness, about the illness, what to expect and how it affects, to make them understand why they had certain difficulties, why they were labeled as different, why they had difficulties in fitting in socializing, in making close relationships, not making acquaintances, but in making close relationships, why they had difficulties in maintaining a job, in not having academic failure, because they were bored, because they were not spacing out at class and the teacher didn't notice them, whatever. And so making sense of all those experiences and helping them overcome them and see the future different is part of our tasks as physicians, as psychiatrists.
It should be a task of people, to be 100% honest with you.
Yeah, of course. But we also, I think, have the task to I wouldn't like to use the word educate, but then to
raise awareness,
raising awareness about a very common disorder and a very interfering disorder.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. That's what I'm standing that boat 100%.
And that's why your podcast and actions like that are extremely important.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the work that you do and giving me the time to talk on my show about it as well too. I'm not anti. I want to clarify. I'm not anti-medication.
No. I fully agree. I know. And I think I think it is very important that you raise that point, because I mean it's not easy and straightforward. I mean we have to often deal with resistance about the diagnosis, about treatment, about whatever. We have to face a lot of and sometimes it's the opposite. I mean, sometimes patients that they have the expectation that they have ADHD and it's not ADHD what they have, and solely because my son is Einstein. Well, your son is not Einstein. He's solely just average, and your expectations are probably too high for them. He's very good in painting. He's very good in certain skills. Let's develop that, and not assume he's going to be a doctor like you or a mathematician like you, or whatever.
Well, Jose, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show, man. Is there a place where people can find your links? And I really do appreciate the time you gave me to talk about ADHD. And also, I appreciate the work that you're doing as a physician, just helping people out as well, to be able to overcome their disorder.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be participating in this. I'm on different social media as well. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. So,
well, if you send me all those in an email, I'll make sure I link them in the description.
Sure, fair enough. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.